Welcome viewers to this series of lectures on European history, and we have been talking of absolutism, the phenomena of the rise of the absolutist monarchs around the 16th and 17th century in Europe. And in today's discussion, we would be talking about rise of absolutism in England. Now, since this content in this particular theme is rather large, therefore we shall be splitting it in two sections, and this is the first part of the rise of absolutism in England. The beginning is traced to the rule of Henry Tudor, and Henry Tudor is also known in the annals of the kings as Henry the Seventh, and his period is 1485 to 1509, and the entire Tudor age ranges from 1485 to 1603. So it is during the period of the Tudor monarchy that we see that England registers the entry of absolutist monarchy. In other words, it is the assertion of the political control of the monarch in the backdrop of several other agencies that were at play before this. For example, you had the church, and up to 15th century, the overpowering presence of the church very much cut into the power and prestige of English monarch. And after this, or you can say alongside this, the presence of church, you also had several feudal lords, because absolutist monarchy actually began in the backdrop of feudalism, and any monarch could have become absolutist only by cutting into the power and control exercised by the disparate feudal lords. And so this was the twin challenge for any absolutist monarchy to emerge in any part of Europe. Of course, the first challenge of the power of the church was well taken care of, particularly in northern Europe, by the rise of Protestant movement. But the second one, that is cutting into the power and control of the feudal lords, was a challenge that was negotiated by different monarchs who aspired to be absolutist monarchs by resorting to different methods depending on the circumstances, depending on the willpower of the monarch, and also the historical you can say agencies that were available to them, and also leveraging the 16th century reality of economic progress, emergence of bourgeoisie, the trading class, the gentry. As such, how did they leverage that to their advantage in order to maximize their power and to contain and control the big feudal lords? So this social base of the absolutist monarchy in Britain or even elsewhere, you will find kept differing, and it is this detailing that we are presently talking about in the context of England. And as I just said, that if we talk of England, it can well be traced to Henry the Seventh, whose period is 1485 to 1509. Now, as I said earlier, and you can see that on your slide, this emergence of British absolutism actually fructified in the backdrop of significantly weakened feudal powers. And this weakening of feudal powers happened due to long and multiple feudal wars that England was engaged in. And one such, of course, as you can see, is 100 Years' War, whose timeline you can see on your slide, 1348 to 1453, and also the War of Roses, which was again a war between different feudal lords, and for instance, as you can see on your slide, Lancastrians were pitted against the Yorkists and so forth. So this particular phenomena of internecine wars between different feudal lords in fact typified the story of the last 100 years before the rise of the Tudors. And what in effect, in totality, what it had done is to cut into or eat into the resources of different feudal lords. And they had not only tired, but there was some kind of a general mood also to get away from that practice, which was almost 100 years old now, of continuous fighting with each other. And so there was some kind of a desire to have some kind of a systematized governance with some semblance of peace and avoiding those wars and so forth. So it is in this backdrop that we find Henry VII actually leveraging the situation in a very ingenious way, in a very imaginative way, and we shall see how he makes use of the available institutions, which all of them were not his creations. Some of them existed in British history from say 12th century, etc. And he made use of these institutions, political, judicial, executive, to muscle in his men, his social support, the people from his social base which was supporting his monarchy and so forth. And that is how he extended the control and command of his rule through these agencies, and that is what we shall see. Now, these wars as a whole had, as is very evident, dislocated economic activities. It had dried up the revenue for the state, revenue for the general upkeep of administration and so forth. It had ruptured the structure of revenue collection. When I say structure of revenue collection, these are the different methods that were there as part of feudal practice to collect rent and give some part of it to the monarch, who perhaps was the biggest feudal lord around, and that is what that is how the conceptualization of a monarch in the feudal times used to be. So there is no vertical hierarchy of officials and vertical arranging of officials in a very fixed hierarchy. Rather, it was the biggest feudal lord is the monarch. So that's how it went. And it had these longish wars of more than 100 years had also created several law and order problems that people were very fed up with. It had parked justice in the hands of feudal barons, and so the structural presence of a particular mechanism or a state apparatus to hand out justice was something that was not evident in the feudal times, and it had become the part and parcel of the rule of a particular feudal lord who would dispense with justice in their areas. All these things, all this scenario had significantly reduced the recognition of England, and England, as all of us know, in any case is an island country, and it had very little recognition in Europe outside the island. And so whatever fame that we find embedded with the history of England actually is post 16th century. It could come to its own and be counted as a power and subsequently as the power in the history of Europe only after 16th century, not before this. So only after the emergence of absolutist monarchy and not before that. Now, coming back to the political side of it, we know that Henry Tudor had also emerged victorious after the wars of Bosworth, and this was fought in 1485, and that's how Tudor monarchy actually began. And after this, he actually set into this tone of, or this trend of putting down the disorder by the might of his sword. And this is how he started asserting after emerging victorious in the War of Bosworth in 1485, and subsequently he went on to crush the Perkin revolt, the Yorkist uprising. These are all different kinds of feudal wars and uprisings, and one particular monarch, or the biggest feudal lord, is setting things in order, is asserting himself, is putting the revolts down, and is getting better of them, and that is how the power, the political clout of the Tudor monarchy actually began to be felt. And his effort to check these disruptive tendencies by investing in a strong state went in tune with the time. And this is what I was talking to you about, that there was a general yearning, there was a general desire to get away from the continuous wars of more than 100 years or so, and that had not done any good to England in any ways. So there was this kind of a silent, latent demand for this, and Tudor monarchy is actually filling this gap in terms of what was supposed to be done. So there is some kind of an implicit, latent support for this with respect to people's dissatisfaction and tiredness with the internecine wars over the last 100 years of its history, and so. Now, understanding this political expediency and using his tact is something that Henry VII resorted to, and he relied on the social base of the new aristocracy and the middle class, and not the old aristocracy. Now, this is where one needs to be country specific in order to understand as to what are we talking about, what mechanism, what actual ways and means are resorted to by different monarchs to assert their power, because this particular mechanism is not something that holds true for all other parts of Europe. For example, if you look at the scenario subsequently in the eastern part of Europe, the monarch almost comes to terms with the big feudal lords, and there is deepening of serfdom in order to assert absolutist monarchy's power. So there is no shift of the social base on which the monarch, the absolutist monarch, actually relied on. So there was not much of a rupture with the past practice with which the monarchies in Eastern Europe continued. The same holds true for several other countries also. But in England, there is a distinct shift in terms of relocating the social base of this absolutist monarchy, and instead of the old big landlords who actually provided the social base for monarchs, now the absolutist monarchy was searching for a new social base, and this answer was found in the fast emerging gentry, or the middle rung or the lower rung of the aristocracy, not the big landlords, but landlords of middling sort, and also the middle class. When I say middle class, think of bourgeoisie, think of the traders, think of the expansive trade and commercial activities as a consequence of which these traders and merchants and you can say small industrial producers or entrepreneurs were earning money, and this particular class actually also was a new revenue resource. Now, to what extent this revenue resource was actually tapped, now that depended on the tact of the monarch. That was monarch specific. For example, in English case, we will find that there is not much of a taxing, but this does not do much harm to the cause of monarchy because of the specific situation that we will be talking about in case of England. Now, with the changed economic circumstances and the pace of economic growth, England had reached an advanced stage of economic development with respect to several other countries, and this is the typical 16th century growth story that we get to know of European history, which is particularly centered around the northern Europe, or you can say the countries along the Atlantic coast, because 16th century is also about, or 16th and 17th centuries history of Europe is also about the shift of economic focus from Mediterranean to Atlantic. So, it is the Low Countries or Holland or Netherlands and England which are fast assuming the center stage in terms of economic activity, and this is where most of the trading activities and economic activities are centered. And it is the people associated with this transformation that are important. And in England, there is some kind of an orthogenetic transformation of the aristocracy, because the lower aristocracy, who we also refer to as gentry, actually seamlessly moved away from the traditional way of farming by resorting to putting out system or enclosure movement, and that's how they started making money from the trade and economic growth that this period was registering. This was in contrast to the older aristocracy, the bigger landlords, who were somewhat loath to this transformation, and therefore they somewhat lost out. Eventually, even they got into the same transformation, but to begin with, it is the gentry which reaped the profit of this economic growth, and it is this particular class which constituted the social base of the upcoming absolutist monarchies. So, from a weak political social base initially, which was an upcoming gentry, middle class, the entrepreneurs and so forth, Henry VII made use of parliament, and this parliament, as I told you earlier, was in existence ever since 12th century. So, it is not a absolutist monarchy creation, rather it is an existing institution that was made use of by the English monarch, by the Tudor monarchs, to assert power. Then you also have very imaginative use of Privy Council, which represented the executive side of governance, and then the Star Chamber, which came into being in 1487, which represented the judicial side of governance. All of us know that in a classic sense of governance, you have the three wings, that is executive, legislature, and judiciary. So all these governance mechanism and components were made use of by the Tudor monarchs in a particular way to considerably enhance the royal power, and this is all happening at the cost of the older aristocracy. Now, as I told you earlier, that Reformation that had begun in the 16th century, not only in England, but it was a pan-European phenomena, and all of us know that England actually came to dissociate from the Roman Church, and it nationalized its church to the extent that we call it Anglican Church now. So that was that gave a major opportunity for the absolutist monarchs to equip the royal power at the cost of church. Towards the beginning of our interaction, I had told you that at one side we have the church, from which the power has to be wrested by the monarchy in order to become absolutist. On the other hand, the big landlords are the ones who had been exercising power in the traditional way, and that had to be eaten into, that had to be contained in order to assert the absolutist power of the monarchy, and both were resorted to. So, Reformation on one hand gave them this opportunity to dissociate from the church in the pan European sense, and it helped them nationalize it, and that further consolidated the royal power that could be exercised by the monarch. On the other hand, we find several ways, as I just told you, that Parliament, which was a 12th century institution, pre-modern institution present in British history, this Parliament was very imaginatively used by Henry VII to legalize all money bill, to seek advices at critical moments. For instance, his marriage to Elizabeth, who was an opponent, a political opponent, was sanctified by the Parliament. He actually reported this matter of marriage to Elizabeth in the Parliament, and Parliament endorsed it. Obviously, the objective was to ensure some kind of a dynastic succession through his son and avoiding civil war. So, the progeny born of this marriage would succeed the king, to succeed the perpetuation of Tudor power, and that is a very important component of absolutist power, that the monarchs or the monarchy becomes hereditary, and it becomes free from feudal objections. The other challengers don't claim the power once the king is gone. So, it consolidated the succession prospects by getting it endorsed through Parliament. So, that is one, and this is very interesting that during his reign of Tudor VII, you will find altogether 7 sessions of the Parliament, and there were more number of parliamentary sessions in the first half of his rule, and when he felt rather comfortable in the second half of his rule, when his position was rather secure, the number of parliamentary sessions declined. So, it was a very instrumental use of parliaments by Henry VII. Similarly, Privy Council, which represented the executive, or you can say modern day cabinet system to see law and order issues, had a strength or was manned by 10 to 15 people, and they were all picked from the newer classes, which was the new social base of the absolutist monarchy. For example, Morton, Empson, Dudley, they are some of the names associated with the Privy Council of Tudor monarchs, and Morton's fork is something that as an expression we use even in the present times, because he represents the imaginative ways in which taxation can be carried out. These are some of the important things. Taxation was an important aspect that strengthened Tudor monarchy, and the lacuna, of course, was its failure to tax trading riches, because they constituted its social base, and they gave loans, they were even favored. Francis Drake was conferred with knighthood, although actually there is a lot of negativity associated with Francis Drake. He was involved in several illegal works also, but the fact that he was part of the social base, the new aristocracy, or the trading class that was supporting him, supporting the king, so that came to his rescue. And to some extent, the captured wealth from church did offset this lacuna, because the upcoming trading class was not taxed. but it became evident by the time of the Stuarts or even Elizabeth, who was the last Tudor ruler. The problems of this lopsided taxation structure became very evident. To begin with, it was not evident, but by the time the last Tudor ruler, Elizabeth, it became very evident there was some kind of a crisis, and it had to devise ways to tax this new class, which had constituted the new social base of the upcoming absolutist monarchy. So this is it, and I shall be talking about the subsequent aspects of English absolutist monarchy in my next interaction. Thank you.